since we've been here, and it's nice to see such a nice crowd. We also have people watching on Zoom on this, so we have an important speaker and an important subject to hear about. Before I introduce our chairman of the district department, I want to say that we've been a little relaxed about collecting our dues from the members. And of course, it's been a bad year for that, but I just wanted to remind you that those dues go to advance the academic interests of the Department of History. And it is a very important thing that we do, and I encourage you, even late as it is, to think about paying your dues at least $75 per year. It's not going to break your budget, I don't think. I want to brag just a moment about the history department. It's one of the strongest departments at UALR, and it's one of the few departments there that their number of majors enrolled are increasing. So I think we should be very proud of the faculty and students there, and they deserve our support. I want to introduce Jim Porter now, and ask him to introduce our distinguished speaker.
Thanks, Dr. Bates. Good evening, everyone. I can't believe we're actually here in person. So it's only been a couple of short years since we've done this. Before I address a few things that I have, and before I introduce Dr. Kirk, Jim Metzger, there you are, has something you'd like to say.
Thank you, Dr. Porter. Thank you, Dr. Bates. Just as the History Institute is reconvening now for the first time in several years, so too will be the Pulaski County Historical Society. Many of you are members, I know that. But I wanted to look at one. There will be a presentation this Sunday at the Carson Museum of Military History on the Dunbar neighborhood. Dunbar neighborhood and some of its prominent citizens. Presenter will be Angela Angel Bird. Many of you know her, director of Dunbar Historical Society. So that talk will be on Sunday, April 10th. Reception at 2:30, and talk will be at 3. And then second, if I could also mention, we too have had the same situation with the Historical Society that we've had relative to dues and membership, because we haven't been meeting as much. So I put some material out on the front table for you. Be glad to have you renew as a member or join as a first-time member. Very simple. Our dues are less than the History Institute. Jess, so how about that? And if you have any questions about that, I'd be happy to talk with you after the talk tonight. I do have some flyers here, but if you'd like one, I'll be glad to. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. Yeah. So I'll echo Dr. Bates and his plea for the subscription fees, if anybody is able to do that. We always want everyone to feel welcome here, and if you're not able to, that's fine. I'm talking to my online audience as well. But just so you know what those funds do that are raised from subscription fees, those buy research materials for our faculty, teaching materials for our faculty, and really, Dr. Bates has given us some nice props here to the department, but we really are a department of excellence, and we're able to do that through the generosity of members of the University History Institute. That helps us a lot. It really does. Over the years, thousands of dollars in matching funds from the Oppenheimer Library have allowed us to acquire a lot of really neat things that have helped us continue to stay at the very top of our game. Okay, before I introduce Dr. Kirk, special thank you to Historic Arkansas Museum. You've been waiting patiently for us to come back, and here we are in a hybrid fashion. I hope this works well for you folks at home too, and we'll see going forward. Maybe we can do that, but it's great, like I said, to see people here in person. And then a special thank you to Dr. Michael Heil. Now, Dr. Heil is running all the tech tonight, but over the past couple of years, his efforts have been Herculean at times. I mean, to be able to put these presentations on Zoom and the shifting logistics, not to mention all the other behind the scenes aspects and elements of the University History Institute meetings with history, Dr. Heil has been outstanding. So we thank you for that. In fact, let's give Dr. Heil a hand. Thank you much. Before I introduce John, if anybody has questions in our online world, please use the messages in Zoom and send a message to Dr. Katrina Yaw. She is our remote online person, and she'll be able to relay those questions to us so we can get those to Dr. Kirk. And also for our Zoom audience, please go ahead and mute yourself if you have not already done so. Okay, Dr. John Kirk, Donaghy Distinguished Professor of History at UA Little Rock. John joined us 12 years ago. It's hard to believe. And I can say it's because of me, right, John? Jeff and I took you out, and John found comfort in knowing that there were football fans in the department, even though we rooted for the power of good and Liverpool, and he, of course, represents the evil of Manchester United. It I think helped John feel welcome here, and we're proud to have him here for 12 years. And in fact, originally he occupied the esteemed position of the chairperson of history for 5 years before, of course, moving on to the Anderson Institute for Race and Ethnicity, and continues to be prolific in his work and his contributions to our department. My note here says he has lots of books and accolades. So I mean, that's a good summary. John has lots of books and accolades. And tonight we're going to hear about his latest book about Winthrop Rockefeller. And so I'm excited to hear about that. But you may not know that John Kirk also is this year's winner of the Chase College of Humanities, Arts, Social Sciences, and Education Distinguished Service Award. And that's really speaks to all the different things that John does in our community. And we're really proud of him for that. And in 2 nights, we'll find out if you bring home the bacon and get the university award. So we're very excited about that. Okay, without further ado, Dr. Kirk will tell us about his new book, Winthrop Rockefeller, From New Yorker to Arkansawyer. John, it's all yours.
Surprise. Great to see you all again. Wonderful to be back in person live, and thanks to everybody at home watching on Zoom. It's the first hybrid event, very exciting and pioneering. I thought I'd come back with some good news. Let's start with some good news to come back with. Last semester, I taught the Seminar in Public History class for the first time, which is a capstone class on the public history MA taught in the history department. And it's there to foster collaborative research skills from our historians. And there are half a dozen people in the class, and we worked from some NAACP papers on a particular case, and we produced a class project paper at the end called Criminal Justice in the Age of Segregation, Arkansas Cases of Robert Bell and Grady Swain, 1927 to 1935. And the paper, just a couple of weeks ago, won the Arkansas Historical Association's Lucille Westbrook Award for Best Paper in Local History this year. And some of the students will be going along in a couple of weeks' time to the Arkansas Historical Association banquet to collect their prize. The prize is a $1,000 check, which gets split between the 6 students and the certificate. So it's a fantastic achievement for our students to be not only award-winning students, but also published students, because the paper will go on to be published in the Arkansas Historical Quarterly. And we have at least a third of the class here tonight, Kathleen and and Jean are here, so we don't often get a chance to celebrate our student success. So please take a slide. Congratulations on your achievement. Hello to students if you're at home watching. Half a dozen in the class, and we'll get a chance to do this again at the Arkansas Historical Association in a couple of weeks' time. Okay, so back to my talk tonight. Winthrop Rockefeller from New York to Arkansawyer, 1912 to 1956 is my latest book, which came out just last month. And it's been a long time in the making. It's been longer than the 12 years I've been here at ULO. So I think I thought I'd start by talking a bit about how the book came to be written in the way it came to be written. So move this forward. So I started thinking about Winthrop Rockefeller about a long time ago. My first book, Redefining the Color Line, Black Activism in Little Rock, Arkansas, 1940 to 1970, came out, if you can believe it, 20 years ago this year, and the 20th anniversary this year. And in the book, there are several paragraphs on Winthrop Rockefeller, and I was writing about him during my first book, and he kind of piqued my curiosity way back then. I made a mental note to go back to it at some point and think about Winthrop Rockefeller further. He piqued my interest for several reasons. One, first question is, why was a Rockefeller from such a prestigious East Coast family doing in Arkansas in the first place? Secondly, why was this prestigious person from an elite New York family in Arkansas been elected as the first Republican governor in 94 years in a state which had been thoroughly and solidly Democratic for so many years before? And finally, why is this Rockefeller, who becomes this Republican governor, considered by some as one of the most liberal governors in the state's history, especially at the time when the Republican Party had just been taken over by Barry Goldwater and was beginning its lurch away from Rockefeller republicanism, as it was called at the time, towards the kind of right that became the Nixon Party, Nixon, Reagan, and most lately Trump. So all those things kind of interested me at the time. I thought I'll make a mental note of that. At some point, I'll go back and do more on Rockefeller. That opportunity came about in 2009, just before I moved here, when I saw an advertisement for a scholar in residence position at the Rockefeller Archive Center, which is based in Sleepy Hollow, New York, up near the kind of Rockefeller homestead residence of Kirk up in Cantico Hills. And at the time, it had just separated from Rockefeller University and had its finances devolved to it, so it had cash to spend. And I applied for a scholar in residence, it was their inaugural Scholar in Residence Award, and pitched them a project on Winthrop Rockefeller and the Civil Rights Movement. And I was successful, became their inaugural Scholar in Residence, spent 2009 there for a couple of weeks doing research, produced a chapter on Rockefeller and the Civil Rights Movement. But doing the research alerted me to just how rich the archives were on Rockefeller, and just how much more there was to do and much more to be written. Then a year later, as Jess was saying just earlier, the opportunity came up to apply for a job here as chair of the history department at UA Little Rock. And I applied not long after getting my scholar in residence in New York. Successfully got the job, moved here in July of 2010. And here, of course, is where the originals of the Winthrop Rockefeller papers are, Winthrop Rockefeller collection at the Center for Arkansas History and Culture. Of course, at the same time, the downside was that I was chair of the history department for 5 years, which ate up a lot of my time. So the papers were tantalizingly close, and yet at the same time, I had this heavy administrative job. Then I went from there to be director of the Anderson Institute for 4 years, so that took even more time. So this has been a long kind of back burner of a project that I've done along the way. And, kind of snatched a morning or an afternoon in the archives. I've been back to the Rockefeller Archive Center a couple of times on funded leave by them. I'm grateful for their support, as well as the Donahue Foundation support for getting the research to do those things. And kind of slowly over time got the project moving along. Did a lot besides in the meantime. In that time, I published another 4 books and countless articles, essays, radio segments, newspaper pieces, encyclopedia pieces, as well as participating in raising a daughter. Our daughter was 5 years old when we moved here. And she was a junior high school, turned 17 next month. So a lot's been going on in the meantime. But the book finally came into focus in just the past few years by a combination of things. Firstly, moving back to faculty, having completed my term in administration, having sabbatical leave, which helps point more time towards that, and of course COVID as well, which also freed up a bunch of time to get on with writing and research and do all those kinds of things. So all those things taken together helped to focus the project in the last few years and get me to finish the book finally, at least up to 1956, as the book finishes there. But it kind of, time and resources over those 12 years allowed me to get from 1912 to 1956. So one of the answers to the question, why did the book end in 1956, is that's where I was when I was 80,000 words ready to finish the book up. But there is also, I think, a kind of good intellectual justification to go along with that as to why the book covers the first 2/3 of Rockefeller's life. One of the things that I did, as well as doing the research for the book and the newspapers and the archives and the oral history interviews and all those things, was to do what all historians do in writing the book, and that is look at the historiography of Rockefeller. That is essentially to look at everything that's already been written on the subject, think about what's missing and what you can add to the story. And it turned out to be quite a fascinating historiography. There are 3 books that are dedicated to Winthrop Rockefeller already. 2 are by John Ward, the Arkansas Rockefeller and Winthrop Rockefeller philanthropist. John Ward was Winthrop Rockefeller's public relations person in the 1960s. He also managed his 1968 campaign. So very much kind of insider accounts. And the 3rd book, Kathy Irwin's book, Agenda for Reform, looked at Winthrop Rockefeller as governor of Arkansas. And I've read all these books before, but starting this project, I reread them again with fresh eyes. And the most fascinating thing I found about them is just how little they had to say about the first 2/3 of Winthrop Rockefeller's life. And John Ward's book, The Arkansas Rockefeller, was the first to come out and perhaps the best known. And John Ward wrote a grand sum of a page and a half, 206 pages on Winthrop Rockefeller's New York life before moving swiftly on to New York, and was praised in the Arkansas Gazette at the time in his review for ignoring New York altogether, that dark and distant place, they called it in the Arkansas Gazette. So what's fascinating to me is just how little coverage there was of the first 2/3 of Winthrop Rockefeller's life. If you want to pique the interest of an historian, you look at the literature and look at the places where it says, nothing to see here, look away, nothing you need to concern yourself with. And of course, that kind of fascinated me most of all. That his entire first 2/3 of his life before he moved to Arkansas was completely overlooked. So then I thought, well, I'll go and read the Rockefeller literature. I'll find out more about Winthrop Rockefeller from the literature on the Rockefeller family. And I discovered that that literature broke into 2 different kinds of movements. The first kind of movement was from 1938 up until the mid-1970s, when the Rockefeller brothers, the 5 brothers, the so-called kind of brothers generation of the family, were really treated from 1938 to the 1970s as a collective unit, as 5 brothers. 1938, a Saturday Evening Post article came out which introduced them to the world as the 5 Rockefeller brothers, and a bunch of books were written. Charles Morrison's book came out in 1953 of those Rockefeller brothers. Alvin Moscow's book, The Rockefeller Inheritance, is a similar profile of all 5 brothers, came out in 1977. And they were treated equally as a collective unit. They were solidified in the public mind because they also had a bunch of interests that came under that brand name. So they had the Rockefeller Brothers Fund to coordinate the charitable giving, the philanthropy, which still exists today. You know, the Rockefeller Brothers Inc., which coordinated all their business affairs. So they were very much a collective and cohesive unit. and treated equally. And both of these books and a lot of the profiles kind of treat them as 5 outstanding individuals from this prestigious family who were a collection of equals. But that changes in the 1970s, and the literature kind of spreads in many different ways. And here's just a selection of books that have been written about the Rockefeller family. There are many, many more besides. But from the 1970s onwards, the literature really goes in 2 branches. One is individual profiles of the brothers. So we've seen the 3 on Winthrop Rockefeller. There's one on Nelson Rockefeller here, one on Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller Sr., one on Winthrop's mother, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller. And in the other direction were large histories of the family. So yeah, the Rockefellers, the American dynasty, Rockefeller century, they give large overviews of the family. And what I found fascinating is that in those large overviews, which come to dominate the literature after the 1970s, and most of the brothers passed away in the 1970s, Nelson, Winthrop, and John all died in the 1970s. Nelson, David and Lawrence kind of lived longer into old age, is that Winthrop begins to disappear from that literature. And it becomes a case of out of sight and out of mind. And Winthrop, of course, had moved to Arkansas in 1953, and he kind of generally fades from the family literature, becomes a very kind of obscure caricature. And the caricature that emerges of Rockefeller is, because he was quite different from the rest of the brothers, he's kind of similarly dismissed as the so-called black sheep of the family, somebody who was exiled to Arkansas in 1953 with his tail between his legs, never to be heard of again. It's easy, and it was easy in the literature, just to kind of sum him up in that way as an aberration and leave it at that, not really go back and investigate very much about what more substance there was to it. And I find that fascinating that, the Arkansas literature only focuses on Arkansas, and the New York literature on the Rockefellers really dismisses Rockefeller altogether and sidelines it. And again, the Rockefeller literature screamed out, nothing to see here, don't look here, nothing to see. The story is already told. And that fascinated me even more then. I went to go and look and think about, what did happen in Rockefeller's early life. And one of the things I did for the book was to interview David Rockefeller. He was over 100 at the time, one of the last living members of the brothers' generation now passed away. And he was kind of interestingly aware of the role that his brother played, and said that it was the right time to look at him and revisit what he did, and thought that his historical legacy, if it was subjected to a greater kind of more rigor and kind of more in-depth look, would change the way that we looked at him. I think it does, as I'm going to talk about tonight. I think the main thing that my book does is challenge this idea that, there's this massive difference between Winthrop Rockefeller's New York life and his Arkansas life. And that's the existing picture we get in the literature. We get this idea of somebody who was a black sheep and failure for the first 2/3 of his life, and then moved to Arkansas, and then suddenly, miraculously, overnight, drank the waters and became one of the greatest governors the state ever had. And although that's a nice story, the kind of transformation story, it's not particularly good history. And it didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me that somebody who would be painted as such an abject failure for the first 2/3 of their life could suddenly turn things around and be one of the greatest governors that Arkansas ever had. So my book really look at the continuities between Winthrop Rockefeller's early life and his later life, and look at the things that kind of spilled over and that tied the two halves together, rather than looking at his life as something 2 completely separate pieces. So to do that, I kind of look at the different cycles, really, I think, which led Winthrop Rockefeller to come to Arkansas. I think if you look at the cycles and examine carefully what was happening in his early life, it becomes less surprising that he decided to decamp to Arkansas in 1953. And there's lots of great photographs in the Winthrop Rockefeller collection from the Center for Arkansas History and Culture. This is an early one of the Rockefeller family. Winthrop is right there in the middle with his mother with his arm around him. But we have at the right in the middle, John D. Rockefeller Sr., nomenclature Sr., who was the founder of Standard Oil, one of the richest men who ever lived, one of the founder of the first real multinational corporation in American history, the Standard Oil Company. behind him is John D. Rockefeller Jr., his son, his youngest child, but his only male child. So he was the one who inherited all the family fortunes pretty much in the kind of patriarchal family line. Winthrop's mother is there, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, and then we have Babs, Abby Aldrich, who is the oldest of Winthrop's siblings, but as the only woman in the brothers' generation of families that became known, kind of became written out of that as well, the family history. On the other side, we have John D. Rockefeller III. Just below him, on the far right of the front, is Nelson Rockefeller. Nelson became, of course, governor of Arkansas and vice president of the United States, and Gerald Ford. On the other side, we have the next son, Lawrence, who was president of Eastern Airlines and a leading conservationist. And next to him is David, the baby of the family there. Then he went on to become CEO of Chase Manhattan Bank, one of the leading global financiers in the 1970s and 1980s and onwards. And Winthrop was the fourth son. He's there in the middle. And being fourth son was an odd and difficult position for Winthrop to occupy, largely because John III, who inherited the family name and the seniority in the family. Nelson and Lawrence were a tight-knit group above him, and David was the baby of the family. So Winthrop kind of grew up being kind of occupying this ambiguous position with the family, was mercilessly bullied by Nelson and Lawrence, who were the two best friends of the brothers, and they constantly bullied Winthrop growing up. And Winthrop often found friendship outside of the family circle. Winthrop writes about his early life growing up, about playing with the sons of the groundskeepers on his grandfather's estate at Kirk, with the chauffeur's sons, with children from the village in Canterville Hills who were all employees of his family estate. And he talks about how he used to go down at the weekends and organize a litter squad with his the employees' children, and pick up litter and host hot dog roasts and marshmallow roasts and all those kinds of things. So from a very early age, Winthrop was kind of expanding his boundaries outside of the Rockefeller family and outside of his orbit, and mixing with people who were not in the kind of rarefied orbit of the Rockefeller family. I think that's pretty significant from an early age. He kind of begins to separate from the family and look more broadly into a wider range of people for friendships. This is a picture of Winthrop as a teenager. He was about 18 at the time at the Regis Institute. And Winthrop's education also kind of set him apart from the rest of the family. Winthrop began at Lincoln High School, which was part of the Teachers College at Columbia University, a very experiential school based on the ideas of John Dewey, who was a Columbia faculty member, one of the leading experts in education at the time. And it kind of eschewed the sort of classical education of the day and the kind of Greek and Latin stuff in exchange for visiting farms and visiting factories, and kind of having an education rooted in practical hands-on experiences. And Winthrop really thrived in that environment and atmosphere. He loved that kind of practical experience that Lincoln gave, but it didn't give him much by the way of academic experience. And his parents moved him to a swanky preparatory school, Regis Institute in Windsor, Connecticut, when he was 16 years old. And his academic shortcomings were pretty apparent there, where he kind of didn't pass a single class in the first semester and continued to have a very undistinguished career academically. Part of this, I discovered, was due to his dyslexia, which was undiagnosed at the time, and which plagued him throughout his life. And it's fascinating to read the reports from teachers who couldn't really understand how somebody who was so bright in the classroom could get such poor grades. In the kind of educational thinking of the day, they all dismissed it as him being left-handed. That was a kind of excuse for anybody at the time. And interestingly, David and Nelson were also suffered from dyslexia. Interestingly, they were also left-handed too. But Winthrop suffered the most from that and struggled to make grades at Loomis. Finally managed to get kind of C's and D's in the class, about as good as he could get. But sometimes being a Rockefeller comes in handy, and he wanted to get into Yale University and eventually got into Yale University, even though his grades were quite poor, because Rockefeller family made quite a few donations to Yale. His senior had given $1 million a few years before he entered to set up a medical center there. So Rockefeller got in despite his grades, but continued to struggle at Yale, perhaps predictably, given his background in academics. And, just about scraped it through the first year with very few passing grades. Just about scraped through sophomore year, although didn't get through sophomore year, so he had to repeat the sophomore year. So they allowed him to repeat sophomore year again. Again, his grades didn't improve. So in the end, Yale gave him the opportunity to fall on his sword and resign before he got kicked out. Basically, they carried him as far as they could, and they couldn't carry him any further. So Winthrop resigned and instead took quite the leap from Yale to the oil fields of the Southwest. And just before his kind of last year at Yale over the summer, he had gone on an internship into the oil fields of Texas and Boston and worked there with the help of his older brother John and set up this excursion for him. And he loved it so much that he felt that that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to go back to the oil fields. So just weeks after he resigned from Yale, he set off on a sort of 3-year apprenticeship in the oil fields, which took him right across Texas over to New Mexico and back again to Louisiana, right across covering all of Texas, and spent a year working his way through the industry from rookie roustabout up to a junior executive. Here he is in Wheeling, Texas, working as a roughneck on an oil rig. And you can see he's second from right with his hat on, covered in grease from head to toe. And he spent a year roaming around with one of Nelson's friends, Richard Alton, and enjoyed it, loved it more than he ever had Yale, loved it more than he had anywhere else. He described it later as some of the best times in his life, just roaming around the oil fields, covered in dirt, digging holes, living in boarding houses, moving from place to place. And it kind of gave him a freedom that he didn't have back in New York as part of the Rockefeller family. It's kind of anonymous out there, and enjoyed just hanging around with the ordinary people in the oil fields and hearing their stories and doing all those things. Kind of an overture, I think, back to growing up as a child and hanging out with the people from the Canterbury Hills and the sons of the chauffeurs and the groundspeople. So he lived it there, and then kind of worked his way up to junior executive in the oil industry. Then kind of got himself an office job, worked with the Coney Vacuum Oil Company. And here he is on one of the excursions. He and Nelson, who's second from the left, went on a 2-month tour of Latin America in 1937. And it was very interestingly when touring Argentinian cattle ranches that the first idea came to own a cattle ranch. He and Nelson came back really enthusiastic about owning a cattle ranch together. Never really worked out, but Nelson eventually set up his own ranches in Venezuela and Texas. And of course, went to Rockefeller when he moved in 1953, founded Winthrop Farms and founded his own ranch there. Introduced the Santa Gertrudis this breed to Arkansas, and Nelson, when he opened his ranches in Texas, bought cattle from Winthrop's ranch to start his own cattle herd down there in Texas. And Winthrop kind of enjoyed his time working with Saccone. He didn't like the desk job, he didn't like the kind of civic milieu in New York, but he did like the travel. He traveled all around the world with Saccone Vacuum. He was the Middle Eastern representative for a while. And just as the Second World War was starting, Winthrop went on an extensive tour of the Middle East and Europe. And he saw the outbreak of the Second World War there in 1939 and came home determined that he should educate everybody in the United States about the necessity of preparedness for war, because he believed that the United States would be inevitably dragged into the conflict soon. So he joined a civilian military training camp, enrolled the camp for businessmen in military preparedness. And then in 1941, entered the military and volunteered for the military in January 1941 as a private, and crisscrossed the United States in training before going overseas and being stationed overseas in Hawaii first, and then fighting the battles of Guam, late in the Philippines, and Okinawa. And here is a photograph of Winthrop in his hospital bed, where he's lying down in Guam after his ship, the USS Enrico, underwent a kamikaze attack and burnt his face, and more seriously, his hands. And you can see he has bandaged hands there, which you can see third-degree burns from. I love this photograph. It's a very kind of suggestive photograph of it speaks lots of volumes. I love the dingy Quonset hut. That was the officers' quarters in Guam for the hospital. I love the Winthrop's fancy pajamas that he's wearing, even though he's in Guam in this hospital. But I think one of the things I love most about it is the fact that they're all sitting around smoking cigars in the hospital, and Winthrop is there, and even though he has third-degree burns on his hands, he's holding a flaming cigar and his bandaged hands. Dedication to the cause. And these are all buddies that he knew from the Third Marines in Guam, as you can see just at the corner there, and this is kind of zoomed in, but if you zoom out, there's lots of bottles of whiskey on their tables. So there they are, smoking and drinking in a Quonset hospital in Guam. One of the interesting people in this picture is right next to him, Robert Crenler, who was immediately to Winthrop's right sitting down there. And his family owned the 21 Club in New York, which is a famous kind of New York landmark, which is still there today. And was a place that Winthrop frequented quite a bit. When I interviewed David, he said the 21 Club was Winthrop's second home when he returned back from the war into New York. So, you know, he knew a lot of people already in the military. It's extraordinary how many people Winthrop bumped into during his military career. He knew from back home in the United States. And again, Winthrop loved his military career. He spent 5.5 years in the military, 16 years overseas. Finally came back towards the end of the war. But in 1964, when he ran for governor in Arkansas the first time, he released the Rockefeller story, which explained who he was. He listed his military service as his most important life achievement. And again, what you see here, I think, when you look at the photographs of the oil industry, you think about his raising and playing with the kids on the estate in Kirk, is the places that Winthrop seemed happiest were outside of the Rockefeller orbit, a long way away from New York, working with his hands, being around people, doing practical things on a day-to-day basis, and just being able to be his own person and not have the kind of heavy burden of being a Rockefeller and all that came with it back in New York. So he also enjoyed his time in the military. So Rockefeller came back from military service and joined the Malou in New York so-called Cafe Society, and frequented the 21 Club, the Stork Club, the Copacabana, and all of those other places, and came back the only bachelor amongst the Rockefeller brothers' generation. They'd all married and had children. He was the only one who volunteered for overseas service to go into the infantry. He felt strongly that one of the Rockefeller brothers should serve on the front lines, and he was the one to do it because he wasn't married and he had children. And he started a civic career in New York, which particularly forged race relations. He was particularly interested in race relations. He joined the board of the National Urban League, which is one of the big 6 civil rights organizations in the 1960s. He was on the board for 24 years and was very active in its activities, and also did stuff in public education and in health, and had a number of positions in Rockefeller family enterprises, and also enjoyed the nightlife. And the reporters described him as the Rockefeller who handled all the nightlife for the rest of the other family. They were quite conservative and demure, and Rockefeller certainly was happy to go out on the town and mix with celebrities. And one of those celebrities he met on that circuit was Barbara Sears, who also was better known as Bobo. Bobo Rockefeller, and here they are getting married in 1948, which was a huge kind of media event. Bobo Rockefeller was the daughter of a Lithuanian coal miner who came from very humble roots, grew up in the Chicago Stockyard district, and became a model and rose through the kind of stage and screen, kind of minor roles, married into an influential Boston family, the Sears family, married Richard Sears Jr., then divorced from him just after the war, and then almost immediately afterwards married Winthrop, kind of whirlwind romance. They essentially eloped to Florida and got married down there. And very soon afterwards had Winthrop's only son, Paul Rockefeller, who eventually followed his father to Arkansas and became Lieutenant Governor of Arkansas. So Rockefeller married Bobo, they had Paul, but the marriage didn't last very long. In fact, 18 months later, the couple separated and went through an even more acrimonious and public divorce. And although they were only married for 18 months, it took them almost 4 years to eventually arrive at a divorce, which went through all the tabloids at the time and garnered a huge bunch of salacious headlines, none of which the Rockefellers liked very much at all. They were a very secretive, private family and didn't like their name being in the press in the way that it was. And Winthrop initially retreated to Venezuela and spent 6 months there to escape the headlines. And eventually ended up moving to Arkansas in the midst of all of this. He was pushed out of New York largely because of those headlines surrounding his divorce, but he was also pulled to Arkansas because of a friend who he met in the military during the Second World War called Frank Newell. Frank Newell was an insurance agent here in Little Rock, and Newell was kind of an older brother figure to Winthrop in the military. And he spoke to Winthrop during their service about how great Arkansas was and how much he understand how Winthrop should come down and set up camp there. And so Winthrop visited him, and it was Frank Newell who took Winthrop up to Pettigene Mountain, which he loved as well, and said this would be a great place for you to come stay. And Winthrop checked it out and fell in love with the place and set up Winthrop Farms there, bought 927 acres at first and then expanded the farm from there. And eventually ended up settling on Pettigene Mountain in Arkansas. At first, many people thought that he was here to stay. They thought he was just here as a refuge from the divorce proceedings, but eventually became clear once he began building Winthrop Farms, setting up the Rock Wind Fund in 1956, which eventually today now is the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation, and funding all these different projects. It became clear that Winthrop was around to stay. And this wasn't just another kind of flight of fancy, but that he was in it for the long haul. And although it was quite a sensation at the time that a Rockefeller from one of America's wealthiest families moved to one of the poorest states in the Union, I think if you look at the total of Rockefeller's life, it's less surprising than you might imagine. Think about the way his life turned out, and, the kind of early patterns of playing with the kids from the chauffeurs and the gardeners, then kind of flunking out of the education. All of his other brothers graduated from Ivy League schools, going into the oil fields where he again found a much kind of better life that he enjoyed outside the Rockefeller family orbit, then going into the military. In some ways, I think moving to Winthrop Farms was a kind of return to those good times that had satisfied him the most and where he'd been happiest. That is as far away from Rockefeller, New York, Northeast Coast orbit as possible, with people who were different from the people he was used to hanging around with, where he could work with his hands, where he could work with stuff on a day-to-day basis, in a very practical minded way. So in many ways, I think Winthrop's move to Arkansas was can be seen as kind of part of the various cycles in his life in which he moved away from New York, in which he moved these various different sorts of environments that were all quite similar in a way, from the fields of Kirk to the oil fields of Texas to the battlefields of the Second World War to eventually the fields on top of Pettigene Mountain, where he set up Winthrop Farms. So I think under those circumstances, if we view Rockefeller from a lengthier perspective, and if we incorporate the first 2/3 of his life and put that in the context of what he did in Arkansas, I think a lot of that helps to explain why he moved to Arkansas in the first place, but also many of the things that he did in Arkansas. And many of the things that Winthrop achieved in Arkansas can be explained by the early life he lived in New York. And the two are kind of mirror images of one another in a way, rather than this kind of very separate dislocation, which the literature's often presented Winthrop Rockefeller's life as being between the first 2/3 and the last third of his life. So that's as far as I got with the book. And there's a great picture of Winthrop, which I like, with his mustache in Leyte in 1944. And that brings the story up to 1956. And maybe I'll do more and update it at some point if I get a chance to, and if I have the time. But for now, I'm going to leave it there and take questions in the first 2/3. All right, thank you.
You told us that he enlisted as a private and he's a major now.
Right.
Did he get battlefield promotions or how did that happen?
Yeah, he was a major by the time he left the United States. So he went right around the United States and he enrolled as a private and kind of went to officer school at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas and got his majority there. So he worked his way through the ranks pretty quickly and around the United States. He was a major when he left the United States to go to war and ended up as a second lieutenant by the end of the war. That was the highest rank he earned just before he left.
Second lieutenant or a major? What? I don't understand.
He was major there, and his final promotion was to second lieutenant.
Lieutenant Colonel.
Lieutenant Colonel, sorry.
Oh, I thought, okay.
Lieutenant Colonel. And kind of came off with the cluster of medals and service medals from the war. Yeah.
So John, at each step, he's succeeding eventually. No, you're not telling it, I mean, how, you're kind of saying, well, he went to the oil field and he ended up an executive with decisions. Then he was traveling the world for the oil company. I mean, he was not without skills.
Right, absolutely.
I mean, how, can you speak to that or how people recognize that?
Well, people don't recognize that, and that's one of the things that I wanted to identify. That, you know, Winthrop Rockefeller had a wide range of experiences and expertise by the time he came to Arkansas. I think the existing literature kind of paints him as a black sheep, footloose, fancy-free playboy who was, you know, just mixed up in New York society, and then he came to Arkansas with no expertise or experience and just, you know, transformed his life there. I think you're right that he did have this expertise, he did have these experiences, which equipped him in those ways. And, you know, in terms of, you know, what we would think of experience and, you know, those attributes would be rated quite highly. But in terms of the Rockefeller family, you know, if you're not Vice President of the United States or CEO of Chase Manhattan Bank, you're a failure. So it's the kind of perspective thing, right? That, you know, Winthrop is successful in different kinds of ways, but successful in ways that are not necessarily recognized as success within the orbit of the Rockefeller family. I think that's what set him out as being different. I think a lot of the literature on the Rockefeller family sort of casts him out because he doesn't fit the model of what the Rockefeller family expectations were for excellence, you know, keeping up with his brothers and doing those kinds of things. And what I suggest is that although Winthrop was different from them, he was different, but also had his own kind of expertise and his own kinds of successes that were just as important. I think there we view, you know, difference as just being different, whereas a lot of the literature up until, you know, up through the 70s and onwards kind of viewed being different as being an aberration and being less than his brothers and kind of being a failure in quotation marks. I think that deserves, you know, a kind of reconsideration. I agree. Winthrop did succeed in many ways, but on his own terms, rather than the terms of the Rockefeller family. You know, in that context, it's a question of how you judge, I think, what is success and failure. In the book, it's kind of refocus that and think about success or failure in different kinds of ways than the literature has in the past.
With everybody from the guy on the shop floor to the guy who's running the business. So is that what you found that he said and was that so? Is that so different from the other rock?
John, could you repeat the question?
You talked about foundations and stuff. Sounds like, again.
Absolutely, yeah. The question was about people skills. Winthrop Rockefeller being about people skills, and that was his attribute. I think you're absolutely right. That's what he did. The other Rockefeller brothers were very much organization, and that was the idea, that you'd sit behind a desk and you would pull the strings from the top of a hierarchical organization, the head of CEO of Chase Manhattan Bank, the head of the Rockefeller Foundation, the governor of New York or vice president of the United States. And those were the things that, you should kind of aspire to. And Winthrop Rockefeller had a different set of sensibilities to that. There's great, one of the, I think the most revealing stories in the book is I write about when Nelson and Winthrop go to visit the family when Winthrop is considering a career change in the military. And Nelson just offhandedly says to him, well, why do you want to do all that military stuff? Why don't you get a desk job in Washington, D.C. with us? We're going to divide the world up between us afterwards. Winthrop was kind of determining US policy in Latin America and doing all that kind of stuff. And he just naturally assumed that that's what you should do. That's what anybody would want to do. That's what attaining excellence means. And Winthrop kind of turns around to him and says, I'm the one who's going and fighting on the front lines and making sure we win the war. And we actually have to win the war and do the fighting first before we can do that. And to Winthrop, that's the most important pressing need, to win the war, to go out on the front lines, do the fighting, do all those things, and those things will come afterwards. Nelson's mind works in a very different way. He's planning what's going to happen after the war and how he's going to situate himself and the family going to situate and all those kind of things. So yeah, it's a very different kind of mindset. And the four brothers have more of this similar mindset, and Rockefeller's this different sort of mindset, and they find it difficult to understand him. Although Nelson does say to him, we know that you have a different set of qualities than the rest of us, but they can't really kind of identify with it. And that's how he kind of becomes estranged from the family in a lot of ways, because they just can't accept this kind of different set of values and skills that Winthrop has, which is too different from the framework of reference that the rest of the family has with him. So I think that's an important part of why he comes to Arkansas, those skills can be well recognized.
At the time you left them, were there indications of the eventual political plan?
I don't think so. The whole politics of Rockefeller, Winthrop is kind of fascinating, I think. I don't think he came to Arkansas thinking that he was going to be governor of the state. I don't think he was particularly sold on being governor. One of the interesting things when you look through the literature is how many people he tells he doesn't want to be governor of the state when they're trying to get him to be governor of the state. I really don't think it was something that he didn't really want to take on, but that he felt he had to, because he loved Arkansas, he wanted to see the state progress, and he was convinced by his advisors, and finally convinced himself, that the only way to do that was to take charge politically, kind of take on the governor's role. And that's why he would, that's how he could best influence Arkansas, because he started doing it in different ways. He started setting up the philanthropy foundations and Winthrop Farms and all those kinds of things. But the book goes up to 56, but I think 57 is a big turning point for him. Of course, the school crisis comes a year later. I think what happened with the Winthrop school crisis kind of convinced him that, doing all this economic development stuff and all these other things was not going to be much good for the state if it was kind of trapped in this segregationist, one party, backwoods kind of thinking. And I think what Winthrop wanted to do and set out to do was to try and change the culture of the state, change the political culture, and to try and change the way that the people thought. People say, well, Winthrop just came to buy Arkansas, but buying Arkansas was the easy part. I mean, he had plenty of money, and he could easily bought Arkansas. He wanted to do something which is much more difficult, and that is to change the culture, to change the way that people thought about themselves and try and transform the mindset of people. And, to some degree, he was successful in that, not in the longer term, but, he made some kind of dent in that, and at least he got them to vote for somebody who wasn't a Democrat for the first time in 94 years. So, he made some inroads. But I don't think he came to Arkansas with the idea of becoming governor in mind at all. I think that just happened along the way by circumstance. I think the 1957 school crisis played an important part in his thinking. This is one of the things I have to do. I have to go into politics in order to get the kind of transformation of the state that's required.
So when's the sequel? You've given us like a, yeah, you've given us a foreshadowing of that. Do we have to have another, lockdown to get?
Yeah, you can give me, 2 years of sabbatical leave as dean, and that, I can make a lot of inroads then. Yeah, I don't know, I will see, I don't have the administrative loan now, so that kind of decreases, I have to pay for my daughter's college next, so that's, so I don't know, I think when you've finished a big project like this, it's a good time to sit back, take a step back and think about what you commit to next. It's a long time to commit for these projects, but it would certainly be fascinating. This is a foundation to build on and to write a sequel of the Arkansas years and what happens next and put those together. But, I think it's important that this particular part of the story is covered because it hasn't been covered before and it does make its own discrete contribution to the literature, I think, and fills a massive gap. And now that we know what happened in the first 2/3 of Winthrop Rockefeller's life, so we have a more kind of complete picture of it. But I think, yeah, it would be interesting to write the sequel based on what I know and what I've done from this, and to kind of rewrite the script of Rockefeller's Arkansas life and update it for the 21st century.
John, did you find any references to Colonial Williamsburg in your research? Because, the whole family would go there all the time. And interestingly enough, when I was there in the late 80s, he was still referred to as the Black Sheep. But if you talk to people who had met him, to a person, they would say he was the really interesting one.
Yeah, Colonial Williamsburg was one of the many projects that John D. Rockefeller Jr. took on. Like everybody knows about John D. Rockefeller Sr. on Standard Oil and Titan and Ron Chernow's book on biography, but there is no real biography of John D. Rockefeller Jr. And, Jr. did so many different things, including Colonial Williamsburg, paid for the entire restoration of Colonial Williamsburg pretty much, as well as building Rockefeller Center, redeveloping the entire Midtown Manhattan, and doing a whole bunch of other things as well. So he did a whole bunch of things, but Colonial Williamsburg was one of the few things that Winthrop remained attached to the family through.
Yeah.
He remained, the kind of president or whatever the role was, the kind of chair of the board of trustees, I think it was. And that was one of his highest profile roles that he kept when he moved to Arkansas. So he continued on at Colonial Williamsburg and did a whole bunch of great things there. And, it's a kind of fascinating double life because Rockefeller moved to Arkansas and spent a lot of time on Windrock, but he was also still a jet setter. He had a jumbo jet up there on Pettigrew 90. He built an airstrip there so he could get out and go backwards and forwards. So, while he was here, kind of out with the cattle on Windrock Farms, he was also entertaining kings and queens from around the world at Colonial Williamsburg and kind of shuttling backwards and forwards from there, representing there. Winthrop also had a huge part to play in the desegregation of Colonial Williamsburg as well, through his kind of interest in the National Urban League and interest in race relations too. So yeah, Colonial Williamsburg is kind of one of the things that it continues to do while in Arkansas. Probably remains, while he's here, one of his most high-profile family jobs that keeps him connected to that Rockefeller family orbit. He never completely disassociates from himself from it, although he does over the years kind of grow further and further away from it. But he does always continue to have a hand in those endeavors.
So I find it interesting that his grandfather ran Standard Oil, and he ends up working in Longfield, Texas. Is there a connection?
Yeah. He works. He eventually goes on to work for Saucony Vacuum Oil Company, which is Standard Oil of New York. John D. Rockefeller builds up Standard Oil with this huge multinational corporation, but eventually gets broken up in the trust-busting legislation that Teddy Roosevelt. So they separate Standard Oil into its various state components. Doesn't really make much of a difference. They still make a ton of money through its various different state components. But yeah, he goes, part of the excitement of Winthrop is that he's the first person in the family after Senior to go back into the oil industry, because John D. Rockefeller Jr. doesn't really take to the cut and thrust of the business world and the oil business in the way that his father did, and ends up being more interested in philanthropy, that side of the family, and kind of doing those kind of things. So yeah, Winthrop kind of reconnects the family roots with oil. But, you know, the Rockefeller family was kind of, the fortune was founded in oil. They kind of essentially had two fortunes. Initially, oil was used in kerosene lamps. Standard oil came from this need to produce standardized oil because all these kerosene lamps can explode and the oil was unstable. So Standard Oil kind of built itself as being dependable. And of course, all of the United States was lit up by kerosene at the time, before electricity. And the family fortune was made with kerosene. And then, of course, electricity came along and that threatened the kerosene business. But fortunately, at the same time, the automobile industry also came up in petrol. So they made a second fortune on petrol after making the first fortune on kerosene. And then Senior sort of retires and then has a whole second life as a philanthropist and sets the Rockefeller Foundation. And essentially is one of the founders of modern day philanthropy and takes over that as well. So it kind of, it's captain of industry and becomes this titan of the oil industry and then becomes, in the second act of his life, becomes a prodigious philanthropist. Gives away about half the money that he makes during his lifetime on there.
In his divorce from Bobo, was moved to Arkansas, was that related in any way to finalizing the divorce from Bobo?
Right, thanks. Yeah, that's a common myth, I think. That's,
Yeah, I knew that, I know the myth. I just wondered if
no, I don't think
you
so.
could prove to it.
Yeah, it made sense because Arkansas had some of the most lax divorce laws in the country at the time. And Bobo certainly thought that Winthrop would move there to get a quick divorce, and she told all the newspapers that, which is kind of where the rumors came from. But one of the things that you find out reading the book is that everybody wanted a quick divorce at the time, went to Nevada.
Yeah.
Nevada was the place everybody went to set up residency and get a quick divorce because they had the laws there, and they also Reno and Las Vegas were kind of more attuned to the taste of the elite than Little Rock and Hot Springs at the time. So,
So is that where the divorce was in Nevada?
yeah, so Bobo got divorced the first time and the second time.
That's because, as I recall, at that time, the only ground for divorce in New York was adultery.
I think so, yeah. It's kind of in the kind of context of today, in the kind of Bible Belt Arkansas, the idea that at the time New York had far more stringent divorce laws than Arkansas. It's much easier to get divorced in Arkansas than it was in New York. Seems a bit of an anathema, but that's the way it was at the time. So it's certainly easy to get divorced in Arkansas, but they were much, Nevada was the place you went if you wanted a quick divorce at the time. And that's where they eventually got. So yeah, it's the kind of common myth that you can't do because of divorce laws. And Bobo kind of promoted that story, but how likely.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.